Right the way through, whether I'm travelling in China or whether I'm travelling to NATO, the overall message around New Zealand's foreign policy remains the same.
Can you just explain what you mean by democratic tradition? What does that mean to you exactly?
Well, obviously, free and fair elections is a long democratic history in New Zealand, elected parliaments. These are things that we share in common with the UK, the US, and, well, in the US they call it a Congress, but same kind of concept, and Australia.
So how would you describe the Chinese system?
That's a matter for them. It's clearly different to our own.
You talked about your approach coming back to bread and butter. What side of the bread is buttered?
I'm not sure.
Are we buttered on both sides? Are we trying to do things for both sides?
Oh, I see I see where you're going with that. I think New Zealand's proudly independent, which means we have a broad range of relationships, and we work with international partners on areas where it's in our interests to do so. Clearly, we have got some long historic ties with some countries and some newer ties with others, but it's in our interests to continue to foster all of those relationships.
China uses the language friend and partner about us, and you're quite hesitant about using that language around them, and yet proactively leaned into that language about the United States today. Are you worried that they're going to view that as a snub?
No, I don't think so. I think, we had a very good, robust set of conversations in the time that I was in China about the areas where we agree and the areas where we disagree.
You seem a lot less friendly on China now that you're back here rather than when you were over there.
No, I totally disagree with that characterisation. I think I've been quite consistent right the way through. So if you look at the comments that I made on our relationship with China and in China, they're much the same as the comments that I made today.
The United States is on the verge of supplying cluster munitions to Ukraine. New Zealand was one of the founding signatories on the Convention Against Cluster Munitions. Will we be telling the Americans and the Ukrainians not to supply and use these weapons?
It's not an issue that I've looked at closely, but clearly New Zealand's position on cluster munitions has not changed.
Will we be advocating for the continued non-use of those munitions by Ukraine?
As I've said, it's not something that I have yet looked at. I haven't seen those most recent reports, but it is something that I'll look at before I go there.
NATO last year included China in its strategic framework, describing it as a security challenge. How are you going to balance New Zealand's relationship with China when you go to the Leaders' Summit next week?
By being clear and predictable and consistent in our position. So the position that I set out today in the speech that I just gave was the same position that I took when I went to China, and it's the same position that I've had in my bilateral meetings so far with leaders of the other countries that you just mentioned. We will continue to advocate for New Zealand's position wherever we are in the world.
What's your message going to be to the NATO Summit? Last year, Jacinda Ardern used it to encourage or ask leaders not to prompt an arms race through the war in Ukraine and describe China as being assertive in the Indo-Pacific region. What's your message going to be?
New Zealand's message is again consistent with the one that I've just set out, which is that we believe in a peaceful world, we believe in diplomatic relationships, and we believe that diplomacy is a good way of avoiding armed conflict. We don't want to see the world rushing to arms. We do support Ukraine. We believe that the war there is illegal and unjust, and we'll continue to support the Ukrainian people in their fight for independence and for freedom. Having said that, we want to make sure that we're preserving our international relationships across the board.
Your comments last year prompted quite a fierce response from the Chinese embassy here. Are you expecting prepared for a similar backlash?
The Chinese government, when I spoke to them last week, were well aware that I would be following my trip to China with a trip to NATO as well.
In terms of having the Defence Force combat ready, what does that mean for you specifically? Could that mean more funding, more things like, in terms of the P8s, that was when it was last used quite frequently?
If you look at the Defence Capability Plan that was released a couple of years ago, it set out that we've still got some big challenges ahead for our Defence Force. So we've replaced the Orion aircraft, we're in the process of replacing the Hercules aircraft. Across the Navy, we've got some big decisions coming up in the next decade or so around the future of our frigates and then what that means for the wider naval fleet. And of course we've got capability issues around our land-based forces, including the introduction of a new fleet of Bushmasters and the upgrade of a lot of our barracks and military facilities. So clearly there is a need for significant investment in our basic Defence Force capability. You will have seen in this year's budget there's a need for an investment in our Defence Force people as well.
Do you see the Air Force getting combat aircraft again?
In terms of an air combat wing, I don't see a significant change in our policy approach.
Why did you proactively bring up the haranguing that Nanaia Mahuta allegedly got from her counterpart in China?
It indicates that the relationship is robust and in a good shape. Where we can have those kind of robust disagreements, it means that the dialogue is open. That's what we want it to be.
On the trade deal, which New Zealand sectors are going to be the big winners here?
For the European Union Free Trade Agreement, it's got pretty good provisions right the way across the board. It sort of starts to give our primary sector a bit more of a leg into the EU that they haven't had over the last 50 or so years, which I think that they will welcome. So we'll see areas like butter, for example, being able to gain significant market access to the EU that they haven't been able to give. We'll set out some more details on exactly who's going to benefit by what at the signing, but butter is a big winner.
Yesterday, the Justice Minister, Kitty Allen, she posted to social media saying that she believes she now has no future at work and she believes all the doors have closed on her. Why is she saying that?
I've had a conversation with her today and I'm not going to go into that. I'd just ask you to give her some space.
Yeah, is she being supported by the government?
Yes.
Yeah, can you go into that?
No.
Just going back to your speech, that felt like a speech that you had done a lot of editing of compared to, say, the speeches that you read out in China. Did you spend a lot more time on this speech in particular in terms of making it more you?
Probably, yeah.
Was there a reason for that?
No, I mean, this was covering issues right the way across the board. You'll be aware that many of the speeches that I gave in China were pre-prepared because they had already been pre-translated, and so that means that the delivery can be perhaps a little more wooden than the speeches like the ones that I've just given.
Do you think very hard about whether you say my government or our government when you're speaking publicly?
Not really.
Just whatever one comes into your head?
Pretty much.
When do you think the EU FTA will be ratified after signing?
Well, that's something that we still have to continue to work on. So one of the objectives of my visit and one of the opportunities, I guess, to engage with other European leaders at the NATO summit is an opportunity for us to continue to press the importance of that.
And are you nervous at all that do you expect the EU Parliament to consent to it?
We're feeling very optimistic about that. Obviously, it's still a process that needs to go through, and New Zealand will still be applying our full diplomatic weight to making sure that we do get it ratified by the European Parliament.
Will you be?
A significant amount of political lobbying to get the deal ratified? It was kind of well known last year that Ardern had to, it took a lot of lobbying to get the deal across the line in the first place.
Yeah, we'll do what we need to do. Obviously, the signing is a very significant milestone and gets us a long way down the track, because getting to that point is an indication that we've got good levels of support within the EU for it. That doesn't mean the job's done, though. And so we'll be certainly, I'll be using every opportunity I have in my engagement with European leaders to continue to push our cause around the ratification of the Free Trade Agreement. And we've got an extensive diplomatic presence through the EU as well, and EU member countries, and so we'll continue to use every opportunity available.
Have you given any thought? Have you given
relationships with the existing relationships with EU leaders to kind of have that weight to push the deal over the line?
As I said, one of the advantages of going to NATO is I can meet with more of the European leaders face to face. Some of them I've had engagement with digitally or via correspondence. It's an opportunity to meet person to person and have those conversations. But also, let's be frank, I welcome and will be encouraging the support of New Zealand's full diplomatic weight around the world, and that includes our former leaders as well, to utilise whatever relationships they have. It's in New Zealand's best interests to continue to push the cause.
Have you given any further thought? Have you given any more thought to the prospect of going to Ukraine when you're over in Europe?
So unfortunately, we did look at it, the logistics of that and within the timing that I have available meant that it wasn't possible.
When did you look at the logistics, and is it just timing, or is there safety concerns?
No, it's actually primarily timing. Well, it is timing. It's a big commitment. It takes several extra days, and at this point, having been away out of the country quite a lot already, I can't commit to that.
If you had the time, would you have gone?
Yes.
Can you go back to the answer that you just gave to the question previous, talking about former leaders? Are you saying that you've kind of asked Jacinda Ardern to talk to the leaders that she has good relationships with to get this deal?
Well, if any of our former leaders or former foreign ministers are in contact with any of their international counterparts, whether that's Jacinda Ardern, John Key or anybody else, of course, I hope that they'll be pressing our case.
Prime Minister, you talked in the speech about being an honest person quite a bit. Are you offering to act as something of a go-between China and NATO, or China and the US, since communication lines there are pretty poor?
New Zealand's always happy to play a diplomatic role in international affairs wherever it is useful for us to do that. I used the example of the Christchurch call as a good example of where we can bring the international community together, including a wide range of stakeholders, to do something that's actually in the interests of all citizens around the world.
But is that something you're quite explicitly offering, saying we have good relations on both sides and we can mediate here?
Not necessarily. I'm saying that wherever New Zealand can offer a diplomatic, can play a diplomatic role, then we're available to do that.
Hey, we only got time for just a couple more questions. So,
Yeah.
Very quickly, you touched quite a lot on Australia, on Pacific, on China, and of the EU and the UK, but not much on the US. Should we read into that? Are we pivoting away from the US?
No, not at all. The US is also, I did mention the US in my speech. The US is a very important relationship to New Zealand, and it will continue to be so.
Given the two...
Kitty Allen, she still holds her portfolios and you're still
Yes.
I'm talking to her when you get back
Yes.
from the trip, that's all still.
Yep.
And
Given
Oranga
this-
Tamariki, why has Calvin Davis still got a job?
Sorry?
Why does Calvin Davis still have a job given what's gone on in Oranga Tamariki, the videos that have gone on, that stuff that happened at Mount Eden all those years ago? He called for Aung San Suu Kyi to resign. Why is he still a minister?
I'm very concerned about what's been going on in the Oranga Tamariki facilities. I think the fact that Mike Bush has been brought in to investigate what's going on and to provide good, solid recommendations about how to move forward, I think is a very good thing. And I'll reserve further judgment on it until I've seen what he comes out with.
Should he resign? I mean, has he offered his resignation?
No, I don't think that's justified at this point.
Would you say that New Zealand has developed a closer relationship with NATO in the last couple of years?
We've certainly been invited now for 2 NATO summits in a row, but I think that's a welcome opportunity for New Zealand to continue to broaden, deepen and diversify our relationships around the world.
Do you feel more comfortable having done what was quite a big diplomatic test going to China and having those meetings? Do you feel more comfortable in that space now? Was this speech and talking about foreign policy, is that an easier space for you now after having gone to China?
Not necessarily. I think it's an indication that New Zealand's relationships are broad and deep, and we need to continue to foster that.
I mean, you've said yourself that it's not your sort of natural thing. You, as a minister, you weren't in the foreign policy space a whole heap. Do you feel, though, with all of these trips you've done, that you are getting better at being a diplomat?
I think the trips are delivering good outcomes for New Zealand.
That doesn't answer the question.
Right,
Do you
thanks
think you're getting
everybody.
better? Do you think you're getting better? Not even singing it.